Now, in order to, the point I will be making is that rather than saying that there is no scientific dispute about this, it would be more accurate to say that there's no scientific evidence for a strong link between climate change and conflict. It's quite possible that there may be such a link, and I'll try to outline some plausible scenarios. But let's take a step back and look at the physical consequences of climate change, because that's where we have to start. And this is, in a sense, regardless of whether it's human-induced or not. Even natural climate change could have implications for armed conflict. But what are some of the physical consequences? Well, there's melting of glaciers and polar ice. There's sea level rise, changes in precipitation, an increased rate of natural hazards, floods, droughts, and hurricanes. It's not necessarily the case that there's full agreement in the scientific community about these precise effects and particularly about how quickly they will come. For instance, recently the IPCC seems to have acknowledged an error in the mistake in the estimates for how soon the Himalayan glaciers may melt completely. But there's basic agreement that these are effects that are taking place and will eventually have important consequences. Now, what are some of the possible social consequences of these physical effects? Well, generally, we may expect increased vulnerability to the physical environment. And this might simply be because human settlements are, in a sense, adjusted to one type of climate. If the climate changes, we'll be more exposed to whether it's a landslide or whatever. We may see increased exposure to health hazards. There's fear about tropical diseases moving further north, and so on. We'll probably see destruction of some traditional livelihoods, which may affect indigenous population, perhaps more than many others. There's fear of extensive environmental migration. Obviously, if you live in an area which is less than a meter above sea level, and you have sea level rise of half a meter or even a meter, then you have to move, and this may affect a large number of people. The number of environmental refugees has sometimes, under climate change, has sometimes been estimated at 150, 200, 250 million. There's no very firm scientific basis for that number, but it may illustrate potential range of the problem. And generally, you could say that there's a decreased predictability, which can certainly be interpreted as insecurity and may actually lead to a subjective insecurity. Therefore, adding all these things together, it's not unreasonable, in my view, to say that climate change is a security issue, and an issue that warrants the attention of the Security Council, which it actually got in 2007. Small anecdote here. I was a co-author of a report on climate change and migration and conflict, published by the International Peace Academy and now the International Peace Institute. And they kept pressuring us to make some policy recommendations, and I thought that was rather difficult because since the conclusions weren't too firm, how can you recommend policy? So we recommended that the Security Council ought to have a session on climate change. Unfortunately, it took them so long to publish a report that by the time it was published, the Security Council had already held a session on climate change. So climate change can be seen as a security threat if you define security sufficiently widely. And I'm sure Taylor will talk about this at some length. But is climate change also an important factor in future conflict? Well, here there's a disconnect between these statements, some which I quoted, and the peer-reviewed literature. There is very little peer-reviewed academic literature on the relationship between climate change and armed conflict. The various studies from defense and environmental industries, so they review the literature. Their conclusions tend to be usually fairly cautious and somewhat mixed. And of course, it's difficult to review literature where it's difficult to draw firm conclusions from reviewing a literature where the scientific evidence base is relatively weak. For the IPCC, this is not a main issue. There are some references to security and the conflict in the IPCC reports, both the 2001, the third assessment report, and the fourth assessment report in 2007. But these references are relatively few. They tend to use words like may, things may happen. Of course, if they may happen, they may also not happen. So it's, and there's not the same kind of probability assessment linked to the social implications as they have to the natural science implications. The IPCC reports, of course, are not original research, but they're summaries of the best peer-reviewed science. And I think for the scientific part, these are generally pretty solid. For the social implications, there's less firm evidence, and the conclusions are more, and the summaries are more questionable. And for the conflict part, unfortunately, where they do say something about conflict, they tend to rely on relatively flimsy sources. The same problem affects the Stern report on the economic aspects of climate change. It's solid on the economics, doesn't have very many references to conflict. It has a few, and they tend to be from the same relatively weak sources. So generally, there is little peer-reviewed research on this issue, and it's very much an issue that needs more research.